What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another Relationship Like Growth Live. We are, I think, a little bit maybe off schedule. I don't know. I think it was about 2 weeks ago we did the last one, so I think we're good. We're going to do a little physics lesson today. We're going to talk about inertia. I'm kidding. We're not really going to do a physics lesson, but I think it is important to understand what inertia is and the difference between inertia and momentum. So maybe a mini physics lesson for those of us who don't remember. This from whatever. I don't know if this would be like middle school or high school for whenever they teach this stuff. But so inertia is an object's resistance to acceleration, meaning an object in motion stays in motion, that whole thing, right? Momentum is how hard is it to stop a given object based on its mass and velocity. Okay. So what we want realistically in a business sense, we want momentum. We want to create a high amount of velocity for the right, depending on the size of our business and things like that. And that way we keep moving forward in an accelerated fashion. Inertia, on the other hand, while it might seem like it's good, what we'll talk about today is actually it can hide a lot of inefficiencies and, even more accurately, ineffective practices, because it seems like, well, we were moving, right? The object is resisting. It's going to stay in motion once it's in motion. So, if we look at the last, let's say roughly 10 years, okay, or even maybe more accurately, from 2016 through early 2022, other than maybe peak COVID, where everything kind of went to shit for a minute. Other than that, things were going really well. If you look at most consulting firms and most professional services businesses, they were pretty consistently growing, right? And the average is, somewhere in that 5 to 15% a year once a company is large enough, $5 million plus, let's just say 10 million plus for sure. And when things are going that well, and you're like, well, we're a $20 million firm and we've been growing roughly 10% a year, we'll take the middle ground there, for the last 5 years, you're going to think, well, we're doing something right. We're doing a great job. Our marketing is working, our business development team's working, everything we're doing is working well. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And then what happened in early to mid 2022 is the macro environment completely changed, right? So if you look at, again, other than COVID, even though you can make some arguments that some of the free money in COVID impacted some of the stuff, but we won't go that route right now. But the interest rates were insanely low, right? Money was cheap. Investment was abundant, especially in pretty much everywhere, but especially in certain sectors like tech and some more risky sectors as well, emerging biotech, for example, and things like that. Debt was cheap. Loans were also very abundant. Banks were giving them out easy peasy, right? So it was really easy for companies to get money. Now, why does that matter for consulting firms? Well, it matters because there's a lot of money to go around. A lot of investment happens. People want to move faster. Again, it's sort of like more. Okay. Hey, we have money to spend. Let's hire some consultants to help us with this one thing, or with a bunch of these things, whatever it is. So it was easy for consulting firms to find work, right? It didn't matter, marketing fundamentals and business development fundamentals aside, it was significantly easier to find work back then. Period, full stop. And that contributed to this inertia, right? The business got going and you were like, oh, well, it's 10% a year. Great. We're just going to keep going. And what ended up happening is companies ended up prioritizing doing more of the same stuff without really stopping to think about how effective it really was. So more blogs, more events, more, uh, articles and whatever. Right?
How effective?
More and more tactics. And the tactical things and the activity was prioritized over strategy, and it was separated from strategy and separated from desired business outcomes, because it seemed like at the high level that it was driving those business outcomes, right? Because most of these businesses were growing. Like you can look at, if anyone's got Sales Navigator, take a look at most consulting firms, right? And a lot of them have stalled over the last 2 years, but they were growing before that. Okay. And it's because a lot of ineffective stuff was already happening. And instead of, now interest rates went up, people don't want to invest. Every dollar that companies are spending, so, consulting firm clients, they're spending is being scrutinized through, FP&A and finance teams, et cetera. And it's much harder to get work. So the companies that back then didn't focus on positioning and differentiation. Okay, I mean, you can look at, it doesn't take much. You look at most consulting firm websites, and they generally, like management consulting, let's take that as an example, they generally look the same. It's some, and hopefully this doesn't offend people, but it's some variation of, we solve complex problems for companies big and small. It's some variation of that statement, right? It's not a differentiated offer, or differentiated position, I should say. Now, the reality is, and I've gone deep inside a lot of these organizations, they could actually be very differentiated. They just haven't done the work to put that into the world. Most of these companies have, some frameworks and IP that they've developed, a fairly clear POV on how things should be done and why they don't work when they're done a different way. Like, they have all these things. They're just not packaged up in a good way to put out into the world. So they end up with some watered down version of, we solve complex problems for companies big and small. Okay. These companies didn't, because work was so easy to find, it was very easy to focus on existing customers, because there's always more and more and more and more work that you can get from them, because they were continuing to get more and more money, right? There wasn't a lot of
well, Mike, one thing to add in with what you're saying there is a lot of the growth that we've seen in companies we worked with primarily does come from existing accounts. And so that inertia is also masked by the accounts you're already working with are growing. As they naturally grow, they're naturally, bringing you along. And then as the, things change in the macroeconomic environment, then they're not spending as much. So you're going to automatically go down with them. And if you haven't built the fundamentals of how do we actually ensure that we're bringing in a reasonable percent of our new businesses from net new clients, if you're not doing that and you don't have that function, as soon as your clients stop spending money, and then also you add into that they're going to be scrutinizing what they're spending more with existing clients. So you're going to have higher churn among clients, and it's more difficult to get into accounts. So, you have really a plethora of challenges that people are facing going into this year on the consulting side.
Well, it's really, it's the self-serving bias in action, right? In terms of, whenever things are going well, human nature for the most part is to attribute that to, oh, these are all the great things that we're doing. And when things stop going well or are going not as well, we generally attribute it to external factors, right? So you're seeing this a lot now, where when things were going well, it was, oh, we're doing great work in marketing and business development. When things are not going as well, oh, it's the macroeconomic environment. No, the reality is both of those things there's truth to both of those, but there's a scale, if you will, right? Where we really need to understand, yes, there is a change in the macroeconomic environment, and it's for sure going to impact business results. But the reality is that you weren't doing enough effective things beforehand, and now it's coming back to bite you in a lot of these cases, right? And, you know, some of the other things to think about is like, a lot of these professional services organizations didn't really have a plan in place to, you know, build trust at scale. And again, that's getting at this idea that we're talking about of, well, if we're dependent on existing clients, they already trust us, right? You know, that's the nature of, we've done great work, just keep doing the great work and they'll keep coming back to us, which also gets us, you know, you talked to Matt Dixon on the Outbound podcast a little while ago, and talks about how, you know, their research shows how that loyalty, if you will, that automatic assumption that people are going to renew is decreasing.
I mean, it's like troublingly consistent. Yeah, I mean, it's a very troubling trend if you're leaning on existing business as your primary means of growth.
But it makes sense. Like, it's to a certain extent a sign of the times, both in that macroeconomic environment. So it's something we need to be considering as we're building strategies, right? And in theory, you want to become, you know, you want to be future proofing, right? So now that doesn't mean if you haven't done any of these things that we're going to talk about, you're screwed. But I think it's important to recognize the problem, because there are a lot of things to consider here. You know, the other thing is, like, a lot of these organizations haven't really innovated their service offerings in a long time, because again, it's like, oh, we're delivering, everything's great. But now that you need something new, potentially, now it's going to take you a while to spin that up. And we're actually going to have, not next week, but I think the following, we're going to have Max Trailer, I believe, on come and join us as a guest, and we're going to talk about service design in particular. That's his specialty, and I think that'll be an interesting conversation. So I won't go too much into that right now. Also, not really an expert in that space either. But you know, this gets into things like even the structure of the growth team in these organizations. If you look at a lot of the marketing function in, say, the average $30 to $50 million firm, it's mostly operational. Right? And we've heard this from people we've both past clients who are now current clients when we were starting to work with them, and also, you know, people we're just talking to in the space, right? It's the marketing teams are generally very operationally minded, right? So it's about how do we get the stuff done efficiently, and how do we get more of it done? And again, that's going back to, well, let's just do more of the same thing, but faster.
Yeah, I mean, it might to kind of put a point on that with the recent conversation that we were having with a prospect. They were talking about how their marketing team is producing more and more and more, but they don't have anybody in the marketing team at a strategic level. So then, you know, the marketing team is basically doing what the sales team has asked them to do historically, but then the sales team is saying, well, we don't really know what to do. We're not marketers. We need you guys to tell us what we need, and then, you know, we can create content together that makes sense. And they just don't have anybody on their team that understands the strategy of how to bring those two teams together and make that work. And I would say, I don't know, Mike, if you have a different thought on this, but I would say majority of the companies under 30 million for sure tend to have manager level and below marketers. And then, you know, if they have a director of marketing, they're usually going to be somebody that is very focused on the execution, and they're usually pretty decent at it, you know, especially events. They need somebody to be making sure that events, you know, that they have everything they need and they go off on time and they're good. But then again, you know, they're really missing that more strategic input from the marketing side. And I would say, you know, to your point here, and I want to use events just to kind of illustrate this, because most professional services companies see events as vital. They have to go to events. That's the way they've traditionally grown. And I agree. I think events are great. They can be extremely valuable if you're going to the right ones and you are activating correctly. But because they know they've gotten business from that, and it's one of the few places that they're tracking effectively for where growth is coming, then they assume, well, if we're going to do more, you know, if we're going to grow, we need to do more events, instead of really stepping back and kind of taking that strategic lens and saying, okay, we believe that events are working. Let's gather the data and actually find out whether that's true or not. And I've been part of the process of doing that before. And it's kind of shocking when you actually dig into the real numbers behind what you're spending on events and how many you're going to versus how many opportunities actually turned out from that. And it can be kind of scarily scary how much you're spending per opportunity. Anyway, that's kind of a side note, but the point I'm getting at is I've seen a lot more effect with events specifically when you want to grow, pulling back on the number of events, going to the right events, and activating the right strategy between sales and marketing at those events. And so that's kind of that more strategic approach rather than just saying, hey, events worked in the past, things are slowing down. Let's go to twice as many events as we did, last year or whatever.
Well, what you bring up, there are actually two components to this, right? So again, going back to I think there's this key point in time, if you will, where things flipped, right? And when things are going well, there's less, again, it's the whole basic thing, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So if there's less of a desire to potentially upend whatever it is that's working, even if you don't know what exactly it is, which means if you don't have the right measurement infrastructure in place, which, to be honest, a lot of small to mid-sized consulting organizations do not. They don't have the right measurement infrastructure in place. They won't do it because it requires a bunch of change management on the sales side of now putting opportunities in at the right time, tracking them, moving them through stages. It requires some rigor, which, again, because we've talked about this in past conversations on a number of our shows, including this one, of a lot of these organizations don't have formal business development teams, so they don't have formal sales processes a lot of the time. Or if they do, they're not consistent across all practice areas, et cetera. So what you end up with is, a bunch of managing directors who only put in deals into the CRM when they're, pretty much through the scoping process, they're very likely to close. And it looks great because then you're like, oh, our close rate's at 60%. Well, no, that's inflated because you're just not putting it in at the right time. You're not really tracking the opportunities that never actually materialize into anything, right? Things like that. Your time lag is going to be, calculations going to be completely off because you don't know how long your sales cycle actually is, right? And I posted about this the other day. Like, I think a lot of these organizations, they generally have a decent gut feel for some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
You ask them how long their sales cycle is, they could give you a fairly accurate answer, but it's plus or minus a month sometimes. And that's a lot. That's one, you could be off by, for a large enough organization, that's a couple $1 million in revenue difference for the year if you're off by that much, and then, so there's the measurement piece, right? When things are going well, there doesn't seem to be a need to more rigorously measure and understand effectiveness because you sort of have this again, oh, things are going well. We're doing all this stuff. It must be working. Let's keep going and not worry about the stuff. Let's focus on doing more stuff instead of understanding the stuff better. And then there's what you were talking about around, again, gets back to this whole idea of doing more stuff in the sense that, yeah, we're doing more events in your example, but this idea of actually integrating activation into it and really thinking about, okay, let's assume we're only attending this event. Nobody's speaking at it. We're not sponsoring anything. We're just attending. Okay. How do we actually maximize this investment? Let's assume that it's a major industry event. These are usually, $1,500 to $2,000 per person to attend, not including airfare, whatever. Maybe you got a group discount, whatever. Let's assume it's $3,000 a person, even just $2,000 a person to make it easier math. And you're sending 5 people. That's $10,000 you're investing in just sending people there. Cool. It might seem like, if your average deal size is $500,000 or $1 million or whatever it is, you get one deal out of that, that's well worth it. Now, the question becomes, how many of these people would have become customers anyway, right? Because a lot of these, again, we're focusing a lot of this, everything ties together. They're focusing on existing customer base, so they're just going there to meet with their existing people. Did you have to go there to make the sale, or could you have just emailed them or called them or whatever it is, as an example, right? So, and if you're going after net new, are you tracking which ones are net new? How are you maximizing your time there to ensure that you get the maximum number of meetings set? All these things, which marketing assets do you maybe
Well,
want
and
to
Mike, I
have
would
to
say a
follow up? All this kind of stuff.
huge piece, especially, the events piece. I like using that as an example because most companies are doing events and a lot of them do not have a very clear process, but they do have some people who go to events and are really successful at building relationships. And but I would say this highlights another challenge that's worth thinking about, which is, okay, so you've got your top performers. They've been around for a long time. They built a lot of relationships. They're getting a lot of, they're seeing a lot of revenue come in. But what about your younger consultants? How are you ramping them up? And I know that that's a challenge in almost every organization that I've talked with, whether it's prospects or customers. It's almost always a challenge of how do we actually teach these younger people on our team how to, first of all, just do the work and get absorbed in that piece of it. And then how do we get those people to sell? And it's usually that person shadowing somebody else for literally years, working with a more senior person. And it's very informal, and that the level of training and the level of success is ultimately going to be dependent on, it could be their personality, but more so it's dependent on the person that's leading them. And if that person is just doesn't have a documented process, they haven't really thought through it themselves, it's not structured, and they're just kind of shooting from the hip, you're delaying the results from everybody else on your team that, that's not currently performing by years. I mean, by years, by not kind of working through that process.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked through a lot of the challenge. I don't know how, if there's a lot of other pieces that you had in mind with that, but it's that I would say I'd kind of classify it into a couple different. I mean, there's so many different ways that inertia can have mass growth, but one thing I would say is just it lets you think that your teams are communicating more effectively than they are. And then when things turn, all of a sudden you go, well, sales and marketing aren't on the same page. And when sales is held to goals that they're not going to achieve, and marketing's held to goals they're not going to achieve, and those goals don't align, they're each going to blame each other. And the less measurement you have in place, the less you're able to really tell who's actually driving results in the business. And so then, usually at that point, sales will get prioritized because sales is closer to revenue, and marketing kind of gets the back burner, even if what they were doing was truly driving the most results. And, that's why when you have inertia and you're seeing things moving forward, that's why it's so important to be thinking through these things and say, are we growing because of the economy? Are we growing because things are going well? Or are we growing because we have the right growth fundamentals in place? We have the right team structure. We have the right strategy. We know who our ICP is. We've really worked through all of those pieces. Are you growing because the fundamentals are correct and in place and your team is aligned? Or are you just growing by default? And as soon as anything changes, then you're going to stop growing. And it's really important whether you have inertia at the moment, because some industries do. There's some industries that are doing just fine. And some consulting companies do better when everybody else does worse. It's just the nature of their business. More outsourcing, people are reducing their team. They want to bring people in. And so whether in this upcoming year, the microeconomic headwinds are in your favor or they're against you, it's really important to be saying, are we growing by default, or are we growing because we actually have the right growth pieces in place and the right fundamentals in place?
Well, and the question is, could you grow faster? Right, is the other one. And that's where I think that that's a difference between inertia and momentum, in the sense of, well, we're already growing. Could we grow faster? Could we create more momentum in our business? And a lot of the time, there's this immediate, kind of like you said, knee-jerk reaction to, well, we don't want to mess with this. This is good. This is kind of a risk aversion, which I understand, but I think it exists in a false sense of security that this inertia that's there is never going to go away. But the reality is it's based on some set of external factors that you can't control. And so, again, I think we can keep talking about that, but what should firms be doing now? So there are a number of firms that who have clearly stalled out either completely. I mean, I've seen firms that have actually contracted over the last couple of years too. But there are a number of firms that have very clearly stalled out over the last, let's say, year and a half. And what should they be doing? I'm kind of asking myself that question, but I think one of the main things that they need to look at is do they have alignment internally about who they are, what they do, and who they do it for, and is it differentiated? Like, to me, that's step one, because a lot of these firms, again, over time they've grown with this inertia, and they've grown organically without necessarily a ton of purpose behind it, right? And you have a lot of these companies that have multiple practice areas and things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But to grow effectively moving forward, especially in a more difficult economic environment, you really need to have your ducks in a row. You can't have 5 or 6 partners on your team leading 5 or 6 different practice areas who believe different things about who your target market is, who your ideal customer is, and what your differentiating factor is, kind of how, in terms of how are you going to market. And I think that's step one. It has to be. And again, a lot of these companies, again, you look at their websites and that tells you everything you need to know. And usually their sales decks say virtually the same thing. Hey, we are awesome. We have X number of employees and 500 years of combined experience and this many offices, and we do solve complex problems for companies big and small. Work with us, right? Like, I'm obviously being fairly facetious here, but
well, the funny thing,
what
Mike,
it
is that a
seems
lot
like.
of those companies feel like that's actually valuable. The fact that they can say that is part of the value. It's like, oh, we can help you in all of these areas. And I think that in the right environment, when you've already built a relationship and you already have a customer, there can be value to that. But that's really taking, again, that more of the focus on account expansion, which is part of why companies get so heavy on, existing growth versus, having
That
to build more.
I think it's also, again, I think it's also a factor of the old macro environment where you could get away with that even on a net new discovery call for net new business, because people, like, there was more work to go around, there was less scrutiny. Maybe it was a referral or a recommendation or whatever, and you were willing to give people more of the benefit of the doubt. Now, when your proverbial butt's on the line, every time you make a decision to hire a consultant or a consulting firm or bring on a software vendor or whatever, you have a bad discovery call and you're like, okay, all they did is talk about themselves. I'm out. Like, there are plenty of other people I can go to. Competition has increased too. Let's not forget that. I didn't even mention this, but the new environment has, and the changes in technology and how we use it has significantly increased competition, right? It's created more independent consultants who are easier to find, usually less expensive than hiring a big firm, right? It's created more competition at the kind of small boutique firm level too, because a lot of people got tired of working for the big firms and decided to go out on their own because, again, everything was abundant. Like, oh, there's plenty of work to go around. I can do this on my own, right? And now you have more people competing for the same, maybe not the same. I mean, there's obviously more, I think, more stuff to go around overall. The economy has grown as a whole, but that's another layer to this, right? Is if you were competing against, whatever, I'll make this up, 5 people 3 years ago, you're competing against 25 today. Maybe not directly, maybe it's not exactly apples to apples, but the competition has increased. Layer on top of that technology of you have AI and every organization, it's every conference is about AI. Every organization's considering it, and
Yep.
I don't want to get into this whole thing of like how valuable is it as in marketing or whatever, but when it comes to on the consulting side, I think there are real questions around, well, how much of this do I need and how much of this can AI solve for me? And now on the flip side, it's creating opportunities for AI consultancies. It's a whole other ballgame. But
Mike, one thing because you were talking about the first step is identifying who you're going after and kind of narrowing down your focus. But instead of saying we'll give it a different step one, I'll just say step 0. And I think this is actually the foundation of what we're talking about today is you have to get your team to admit that you have a problem.
Yes, that's a good point.
And when you have inertia, it's easy for everybody to ignore when they know that there's actually is an issue, because is it actually worth solving these structural problems when you are growing? And so it's easier to ignore it. And people walk around the elephant in the room, and you've got 10 partners and they're all walking around this elephant every day. They all know it's there, but nobody wants to be the one to touch it because you're growing and things are working effectively. And so to me, the first step, or the step 0 before you can take a first step, is getting your team to agree that there is a problem, and then agree on what the problems are that you can, so that you can actually identify where you need to focus. And most of the time, I would say 9 times out of 10, when we're working with a firm, it is that audience piece. It's that they don't really know who their ideal customers are. They might have an idea of their target list, but they're usually a little bit too broad, and they don't necessarily know where those people hang out, what platforms they should be focusing on. And then the messaging is another element of that.
You bring up a really good point, actually. Before I go there, there are a number of folks live. If you're live, drop a message for us. Tell us who you are and where you're joining from. And then if you have questions, comments, just pop them in there. We'll definitely leave time toward the end here to answer them, or if it fits in, we'll just take a tangent. Happy to do that too. So thank you all for joining us live. You brought up a good point, Joseph, which is this admitting you have a problem. And that's hard. That is, let's be honest, that's a really difficult thing to do as an individual, even to yourself. Not to mention, like, there's a reason the 12-step program exists, right? Like, never done it, but anyway. Point being is, I think it has to start from the top down, and I think leadership needs to make it abundantly clear and make it safe for people to make this admission to themselves and to the team. Because again, I think in a lot of conversations we have, people usually know that something is off, and they might even have a decent idea of what that something is, but for a variety of reasons, either don't want to admit it or feel like they can't admit it. And I think that's also a big part of the problem. And I think in many organizations, leadership enables this, right? So when things are good, this kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And let's not invest in improving our measurement because we don't really need that right now. We got to keep pushing, or whatever it is. That often comes from the top. And I think at the same time, it has to come from the top of, hey, this isn't working, people. Let's have we're going to have an intervention. This is a safe space kind of thing. We're going to address the fact that we have a problem, and we're going to figure out how we can solve it together kind of thing. I think that type of conversation has to happen.
Yeah, Mike, it's actually kind of funny because that image of the elephant in the room with all these partners walking around is like stuck in my head. And I think what's actually most of the time going on is people are like, I think there's an elephant in the room, but I'm not quite sure. And everybody else is walking around the elephant. And I'm not 100% sure that there is an elephant, but it looks like it's me. So, or maybe there's just some big dark object and there's not enough light on it. And you're like, kind of barely see the definition, but you don't want to be the person out of everybody to rock the boat. And, especially a lot of times marketing reports directly into the CEO or into the president or something like that. Yeah. And they could be, not reporting to the same person as sales, and that happens quite often. So then it's like, do I really want to throw this other department under the bus? And what if I'm wrong about that? Then you've got the president, who's the one kind of driving the directive, or whoever the person is over marketing. They typically have these pet projects or these pet things that they think are really important, that they kind of get a little bit upset when anybody goes against it. So then you've created this culture when you have, especially when you have inertia, to kind of keep the elephant there and not let anybody talk about it, which, I know is what you were just addressing.
Yep.
So,
Exactly. And then,
having said that, what are some ways that companies can start resolving that? Because I think out of everything we could talk about on the call, that is actually, on the conversation today, that is actually the thing we're seeing most prevalent. I think when we're talking with customers is the inability for their team to recognize the problem and be willing to and able to discuss it as a group and deal with it.
I think once you've had this conversation that we just talked about, right, of, hey, there's this problem. And the reality is this problem can exist in an organization that's actually growing still. It doesn't have to be. I think that's another important part to mention. Like, your firm could have just grown by 20% year over year, but it grew, again, potentially in spite of all of this. So you maybe could have grown more had these things been resolved already. So I think it's really, I think my opinion, it behooves everybody, whether you're growing or not, to really look internally. And self-promotion here, we created an assessment that people can take to highlight these things. You should probably put that put a link to that here. Now that I'm thinking about it, but so if you want to take the assessment, it's, should take you about 15, maybe 20 minutes if you take your time on it. But it's really built to help highlight where some of these misalignment issues are. And it's also meant to address this whole perception, right? Because sometimes, again, we think things are good, but when we really start digging into it, we're like, oh, okay, maybe they're not as good as I thought, right? So becoming both self-aware and then also becoming aware of the differences in perception amongst leadership and different key stakeholders is really important. So anyway, we have the assessment, but even if you don't take the assessment, you can at least look at it, just ask yourself some very basic questions internally around, like, is our growth function, so business development and marketing, is it really working in concert together to drive growth? Do we have the right content to send to people, throughout the journey, the relationship journey? Do we agree on who our ICP actually is? Do we agree on what our secret sauce is? Right? Like, one of the basic questions, like, well, what's your secret sauce? And I ask this to virtually every single, consulting firm leader that I speak to. And I don't make this up, but 99% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, the answer is, well, it's our people. And it's like, well, sure, but every single person is saying that. So that's not your secret sauce, realistically. At least it's not the secret sauce that you can put out there as the differentiator, because every single competitor you have has that same secret sauce in that case, right? So, like, can we agree? Like, ask yourself, like, do the partners all agree on what our secret sauce is? Like, those types of things, I think everybody can look internally and ask themselves those questions and just check. If the answer is no, we don't agree, if you got half the people saying, well, we think we should go after SMBs, and the other half are saying, no, we should go after enterprise, you got a problem, potentially, right? I'm not making that up completely. Or some people say that the secret sauce is this one framework that we've developed, and the other secret sauce is whatever, I don't know, deep expertise in a particular industry. Well, those are two very different things. And maybe they can go in concert together, maybe they can't. But identifying these areas of potential misalignment or actual misalignment has to be the first thing that happens. I don't know, Joseph, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I'm pretty much just echo exactly what you're saying. It's I dealing with that and identifying that there's a problem and getting your team together is paramount. If you haven't done that and you can't do that, that's really where your problem is. I mean, you've got to start there. And if you're noticing that there is an elephant in the room and nobody else is talking about it, then, not to be self-promotional, but I would encourage you to take that assessment because it can at least give you an idea if there's some areas in your growth function that are potentially misaligned, out of alignment, that needs some help. But if not, then, it's at least just starting that dialogue with people internally and really getting that together. Because if you try to do any marketing or sales and you haven't actually identified whether you have an issue or not, what I mean is, like, if you're trying to start some net new campaign and you think we should start a podcast or we should start getting our team to activate on LinkedIn. I'm just using some of the ones we like around here. Or, we're going to start doing blogs or SEO, or we're going to double down on events. If you're going to focus on any of those things and you haven't actually identified where the problem is in your growth function, you're going to have an issue. So definitely would recommend starting with that.
Yeah, and I think from there, I mean, we already started talking about the positioning piece. I think if your positioning is solid and you are still experiencing stalled growth, again, I think you have to consider the macro environment. People are buying differently. There's much more scrutiny involved. So a core focus really has to be de-risking the buying decision. So your strategy and the execution of such strategy needs to be focused on that, right? Why you, right? So your positioning is a big part of that, but now you have to disseminate it, and you have to also really find ways to activate your business development team against that. So that's things like we can get pretty tactical, but could you create a podcast around your core POV and invite your ideal customers to that show to interview them, and not to sell them. Don't do that crap. Like, it's not you're not inviting them on to have a business conversation. You're inviting them on to have an actual interview and create some valuable content. Now, if a business conversation comes out of that, awesome. And guess what? A lot of the time it does. But it's not, that's one part of it. Then it's great. How do you activate against that afterwards? How can your business development team invite people? Is somebody from business development hosting that show that's talking about this POV, which allows your biz dev people, like, let's assume they are not consultants. So in certain situations, we do find that there is a dedicated biz dev team. They're not as close to the work. This gives them the opportunity to put things out into the market that gives them more of that thought leadership persona and makes it easier for them to start conversations. Do they have an easy way to access the various assets that come out of this, like micro clips and full episodes and whatever, in their follow-ups, right? If they're having a conversation with somebody and somebody asks a question, can they easily go, oh, well, we just had so-and-so on our show and we talked about this. Here's how they were solving it. We had an interesting conversation. Let me send that to you, right? Do you have that kind of playbook available? So I'm getting pretty tactical, but it's these types of things. The same thing applies to events, right? Like, if you're going to invest in these events, we were talking about this earlier, how can you maximize that investment? How can you ensure that you can start as many conversations as possible whether you're attending or sponsoring or whatever, right? So what are you doing pre-event, as an example? And again, how are you connecting that to your core position and your POV?
Yep.
A lot of the time, again, in the era, if you will, of more, it didn't really matter. It was more like people just did, there's a lot of this, like, hey, we're attending this event. Who's going to be there? Let's talk, right? And there's a lot of that. But now, where everything is a much more considered purchase, if you will, even more so than it would have been otherwise for a $500,000 consulting engagement or something. how can you start, building affinity and trust at scale, right? So pre-event, are your people posting about, if they're speaking, are they posting about their kind of core POV and connecting that? Or if they're going to this event and they're not speaking, are they posting about a core topic that's being there and giving their opinion on it and saying, hey, if you want to, I'd love to talk to people about this at XYZ conference. Let me know if you want to chat, right? Like you're giving people a reason to actually schedule that meeting with you.
Yep.
Right? Like, unless like, if you're somebody famous, like if, whatever, you've got 100,000 followers on LinkedIn and you're like the person that everybody wants to know in your industry, you probably get away with just saying, hey, I'm going to be there. If anybody wants to talk, like, let me know. People are going to be clamoring to talk to you. But unless you're that person, not going to happen. Right. So you have to give people a reason to do those types of things. And again, I think it all ties back to who is your target and having agreement on that. What is your position and, strategic narrative, core POV, et cetera, and agreeing on that. And then disseminating that throughout, right? Through everything that you do, whether that be a simple, hey, I'm going to be at this conference post, whether that's a webinar you're putting on, whether it's a podcast you're hosting, whether it's a God forbid, a white paper you're writing, any of those things. And I think you also have to ensure you have the right rigor in place to measure the effectiveness of these things, right? And that means capturing certain information you probably weren't before. And I don't know. I mean, I keep going on and on about that, I guess.
I mean, I think there's a thread, Mike, that we've seen and that we're talking about today, where when you have inertia, there's a lot of different pieces that are not connected together, but it's working for you. Like a thought that comes in my head is you got these gears that are all spinning separately and it kind of works while the car is moving and you've got some inertia going. But then if you hit a little bit of a hill and you don't have the clutch and connecting all those gears together, now all of a sudden you're not going to go anywhere. You're going to start to stall out and your growth is going to slow down. So that's where
I was hoping you would come up with some like engineering related analogy for me. That's not my thing.
So the point is that if you don't have all of those gears aligned together, then they're not as effective as they could be at the very least, or they might not actually be doing anything for you except for just spinning around. And in some cases that is actually what's happening. You're doing a lot of activities, there's a lot of motion, but you're actually growing in spite of those things. Sometimes just cutting certain things out might actually help you grow faster. But then what I'm getting at here is when you do pull all the pieces together and they're working in unison, that's when you can actually multiply growth. So when you have marketing and sales that are sitting down together in a planned meeting, I'm just going off of a great event strategy from the Outbound podcast. I just had Neil Barrow on the show and he talked about his event strategy and it's excellent. It's just basically 6 weeks ahead of time. You're sitting down and you're actually planning out what you're going to do at this event together with everybody that's going to be there. And you say, okay, here's the list of speakers. Who do we need to make sure that we get a meeting with? Here's the list of things that, individual speaking things that individuals want to go to and topics or whatever. You plan out your calendar ahead of time. And then you book meetings in advance as much as possible with the people that you want to be meeting with. Or you just reach out to them and connect and make that happen ahead. And you're basically just doing everything you can to proactively fill up your calendar with the right meetings ahead of the event. So that then you're not getting there and you show up and you're just like, well, I hope I happen to run into the, CMO of marketing at one of my top 25 accounts. And it happens, you go to an event and sometimes that'll happen. But why not be more proactive and make those conversations happen? Because you actually sat down as a team, got on the same page about who you need to go after, and actually have a plan that marketing and your business development team work on together. And if you have partners, that they're involved in that conversation. And so we're kind of talking about on the large scale doing that as a company, like getting the different departments to talk together and actually have a unified strategy, unified messaging, have agreement there from a high level. But that even goes down to the ultra tactical level of planning out an event and making sure that everybody's on the same page, or hey, you have somebody in business development that is excited about creating content, but that's not really their thing. The marketing team working with them to make sure that that's actually effective, and both of those teams working together and making sure that you're actually creating things that the sales team is going to use. And then on the sales side, understanding what you're asking of marketing so that you're not asking for something that's completely ridiculous and will take them way more time than what it's worth. But that only happens if you say, hey, we are one team. Here's our goals. Here's what we're actually trying to do. What do we need to do that most effectively together? And it's amazing. I'll just say it this way. I'll say it in a more positive way. It's amazing how much opportunity there is for growth when your teams actually do that. And I guarantee you almost none of your competitors actually operate that way. So if you want a true differentiator in your growth, getting your teams to actually talk together on the growth side and serving your customers by creating content that's actually valuable to them as a whole team, and serving them by getting in front of them at the right time and giving them what they need to grow their business. It's amazing. It's amazing what happens when you do that.
Yeah, and I think the shifting your focus from more being always the answer, because I think that's especially when it's a drastic shift, right? Hey, we've been growing pretty consistently for 5 or 10 years, and now all of a sudden we're not. Clearly, we need more. Like there are headwinds. We just need more to beat these headwinds. And the reality is probably not. It's not just about more. It's about doing the right things. And it's very likely. And even if you were doing the right things 2 years ago, so much has changed that those things might no longer be the best things to do. So I think that's maybe a good place to wrap up. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to message us directly. We're pretty active on LinkedIn, so just ping either Joseph and I. Happy to chat. Other than that, thank you all for joining, and please come back next week. We've got a really awesome show. We've got a great guest joining us as well.
Actually, talk kind of about this. Yeah, Brian Walsh from Force Management. We're going to be talking about alignment. Their team, focuses a lot on the sales side, on aligning the right people on your team, and that's really what we're getting into. The basis of what we're talking about here too is getting your teams on the same page, getting the different levels of leadership on the same page, so that you're able to grow. And that's something that their team really focuses on a lot. So super excited to have him come and share his wisdom.
Yep. It'll be an awesome conversation. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you all next week.
Catch you guys next time.